All right, so learning objective 7, we're going to understand the specifics of how the Federal Reserve actually controls this federal funds rate. So we mentioned in the last part, we developed the federal funds market, understand what the federal funds rate is. It's an interest rate that banks charge each other on overnight loans for reserves. And the Federal Reserve Bank actually tries to control that interest rate, or they have a target and they keep the interest rate fixed at that target by manipulating supply and demand of reserves. So how do they do that? How does the Fed manipulate supply? Well, they kind of can manipulate supply or demand. So there's three main tools that they have. And the main one that they use is what we call open market operations. So here the Fed is going to buy and sell Treasury securities from banks. So first of all, what in the world is a Treasury security? Well, that is a U.S. Treasury security. And so when the government borrows, that's how they borrow, right? So how does the government take out a loan? Well, they just issue what is basically a bond. They issue a sheet of paper that says, here's $1,000, or give me $1,000. And here's a sheet of paper that says, it is a loan agreement that says, the U.S. government will pay you back this $1,000 in 3 years, along with some interest. Okay? So the government issues these Treasury securities, and people buy them. And that's one of the assets that banks accumulate. So we talked about banks, and they have assets and liabilities. So fractional reserve banking means that banks only keep a fraction of your deposits on hand as reserves. The rest of it they use to buy assets. That's how the bank makes a profit. So one of the assets that banks purchase are Treasury securities. That is a relatively safe investment for a bank to engage in, right? The government is most likely to pay back its debt, and so banks don't have to worry too much about losing their money. So it's a good investment for banks. Now, banks have these securities, and what the Federal Reserve can do is to buy and sell those from banks in order to manipulate their reserves. So let's think about what happens, right? So if the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury security from a bank, what happens is the Fed gives the bank money, which are reserves. Right? The Fed says, okay, you have your account here with the Fed that you have reserves in as deposit, and we're going to credit that account with $1 billion. And in return, you give us $1 billion worth of Treasury securities. So the Fed gives the bank reserves, and the bank gives the Fed the asset, which is the Treasury security. So in that sense, the Fed has increased the supply of reserves. So let me kind of go down here. Quantity of reserves and the federal funds rate. The Fed can increase the supply of reserves by buying Treasury securities from banks. Now, if the Fed needs to decrease the supply of reserves, they can sell Treasury securities. So if the Fed sells them, the Fed also has in their balance sheet, the Fed is like any other bank, right? They have a balance sheet. They have liabilities, deposits that banks hold on hand, and the Fed holds assets. That's how the Fed earns profit. I said the Fed doesn't get tax revenue. How do they pay all their employees? Well, they pay them by making a profit as any other bank does. They hold assets that earn interest. So the Fed has these assets, Treasury securities among them, and so the Fed can sell those, and the Fed is going to Fed gives banks the asset, the Treasury security, and in return then, those banks have to give the Fed money or reserves in exchange. Banks give Fed reserves, which is money. Right? So that's going to decrease the supply of reserves in the federal funds market. The Fed is taking money out of the banking system when they sell Treasury securities. Here's an asset. You give me money in return. That takes money out. Buying, here's some money. You give me the asset, is going to increase supply. So on a day-to-day basis, that's what the Fed does for the most part, is to buy and sell Treasury securities to keep that federal funds rate fixed at their target rate. Now, they also have two other options that are used less frequently, but they are still used from time to time. So one is the Fed can actually pay banks interest on reserves. So banks keep reserves on deposit at the Fed. That we've talked about before. So banks keep reserves on deposit at the Fed. Those can earn some small amount of interest. So in that sense, it's like a savings account or an interest-paying checking account. And so the Fed then can manipulate the interest they pay on those reserves to influence demand. So if the Fed increases the interest they pay on reserves, banks want to hold more reserves. And when they hold more reserves, the demand for reserves in the federal funds market is going to decrease. Banks have plenty of reserves to cover transactions. They don't have to go to the federal funds market as often. So demand is going to go down. Obviously, it's vice versa, right? If they pay less interest, then banks are going to hold fewer reserves on hand at the Fed, and they're going to have to go to the federal funds market more frequently to cover their liquidity needs. All right, so the other way that the Fed can keep the federal funds rate fixed at its level is to manipulate demand. So here's demand that starts, and the Fed can increase demand by increasing interest. They can decrease demand. They can increase demand by decreasing interest. So I pay you less interest on your accounts. You're going to go to the federal funds market more frequently, and that's going to increase demand for reserves. I can decrease interest, increase interest, and that will similarly cause a decrease in demand. Banks keep more reserves. They don't have to go to the federal funds market as often. Now, I've kind of run myself out of room there, but the last one that works very similarly is the reserve requirement. So we said before that was about 10%. Banks have to keep 10% of reserves, and they have to have reserves on top of that to cover transactions. So if the Fed was to increase that to 20%, well, that's going to increase demand for reserves in the federal funds market. So the Fed could shift demand to the right by increasing the reserve requirement. And if they decreased it, banks don't have to keep as many reserves on hand. That's going to decrease the demand for federal funds. So I can decrease the interest rate or increase the reserve requirement in order to increase demand. I can increase the interest rate or decrease the reserve requirement to decrease demand. So remember, demand is moving around, and the Fed wants to keep the interest rate pegged at a certain level. And these describe the tools the Fed has in order to accomplish that. Most of the time, they change supply by shifting it around. Sometimes they use these other two tools to shift demand in the opposite direction to keep the federal funds rate fixed at the level they're trying to hit it at. In my previous example, that was 2.5%. Okay, so in the next video, I'll kind of show you some examples of those changes, and we can work through them in each of the cases that we just discussed.